Well, strange angle. Overall, I think it was a useful meeting, even though I think one should not be carried away too much, because clearly there are still some obstacles to be overcome for the Geneva II conference to be convened. First of all, I heard some of your previous questions. Certainly, this meeting was not about any kind of official recognition of the national coalition, and there was a very clear understanding to that effect among members of the Security Council. As you know, in fact, ARIA formula is not even an official aspect of work of the Security Council. It's simply an opportunity for members of the Council to meet with people of interest, and I do believe that we have met with the people of interest, and I think we had a good discussion. I think the points I was making were coming across, and I got some responses from the people we're meeting with, the leaders of the national coalition. Well, actually, the first point I made was a request. You may remember that back in April, two Orthodox bishops, metropolitans, were captured by some people in northern Syria. So I asked Mr. Jarba if he had any information about them, and asked for the help of the national coalition in rescuing them from captivity. He did say that he was aware of the situation, and did promise to exercise his personal influence in order to try and find those people and bring them out of captivity. Well, other than that, since we're talking about talking with leaders of the opposition, I pointed out some problems we see on the opposition side. I expressed concern about increasingly frequent use of terrorist methods by various opposition groups. There was a recent, just 2 days ago, another car bomb explosion, apparently suicide attack in Damascus, which killed a number of people and injured several dozen people. I expressed concern about the reported use of chemical weapons by armed opposition groups. As you may remember, Russian experts investigated the alleged use of chemical weapons on March 19 and came to the conclusion that it was an armed opposition group who used that. And again, the leaders of the national coalition assured us that they would actively discourage all those who might be contemplating that from resorting to the use of chemical weapons. At least that was my understanding of their response. I did express some concern about the relationship of what they sometimes call moderate armed opposition groups with extremists like the Al-Nusra front, because there seems to be a complicated relationship. On the one hand, one hears reports about clashes among them. On the other hand, even more reports about them working together on the battlefield, and of course that raises all sorts of concerns about their political presence in the country. I mean, one can make all sorts of declarations about bright democratic future of Syria, but if in the process of the crisis we see Al-Qaeda affiliated groups gaining this kind of influence, of course the future of the country is considerably dimmed. And I pointed out that it was the document of the G8 summit in the United Kingdom, where they raised the need for the government and moderate opposition groups to fight together extremists in Syria. But I think the more important part of this discussion was about convening Geneva II. And my pitch was to go to talks without preconditions, and we all know that there is Geneva Communique, and they must get together and discuss how the Geneva Communique could be implemented in its entirety, as simple as that. And I regret that there is still an effort which I saw from leaders of the national coalition and also, unfortunately, some members of the Security Council, to complicate matters by starting interpreting various provisions of the Geneva Communique in advance of the beginning of the negotiations. I mean, this is an extremely complex political crisis in an extremely complicated country with the history of more than 2 years of fighting, and to apply some Descartes principle to already in advance interpreting, to me it's not serious, really, and extremely counterproductive in terms of trying to get to Geneva II. But again, I had the impression that even though not all of my arguments may have been accepted by our interlocutors today, but they listened, and I think they took them in, and I hope at least to some extent it will help us, Russia, together with the United States, together with Lakhdar Brahim and the United Nations, prepare and bring about the convening of Geneva II.
Mr. Ambassador, did the opposition mention how much? What's their percentage of the society? How much are they?
I don't want.
Opposition, which is not
I don't want to. They will speak to you, I'm sure, at some point. I don't want to recount what they were telling us. I think they're perfectly able to do that themselves.
Mr. Ambassador, two questions. You started out saying that you thought that there were still some obstacles to Geneva II. Could you spell out what you think the obstacles are? And also, when you talk about this differences over the wording, obviously you're talking about what full executive powers mean. Is that correct? And don't you believe that full executive powers means full executive powers?
Well, I do mean that, yes. That full executive powers means full executive powers. But I don't need any Descartes guy to explain to me what it means, I think this is what they need to do when they go to Geneva and sit at the table and see how they can use the Geneva document in order to come to accommodation and to end the crisis in Syria. So among obstacles, yes, the fact that I think still the national coalition sort of contemplates certain preconditions for them to be ready to go to Geneva II. Secondly, my understanding of what they had to tell us is that they are not entirely ready yet in terms of a joint unified delegation, because I understand they're having various contacts with the National Committee, with the Supreme Council of the Kurds of Syria, but there is a common understanding has not yet been achieved among them to be jointly represented in Geneva. So I think that those are basically two things. And secondly, well, another aspect of our discussion, of course, I did express some concern since they were mentioning, among other things, that they needed more weapons, etc., etc. So, and some other remarks they were making sort of were leading in the direction of further conflict, which would with no obvious end in sight. I even recalled my visit some time ago to northern France, where many of you have been, where they have this big field, and along the road there are two pegs, one saying January 1, 1916, and the other one just 1 kilometer away saying October 1, 1916. And this is the distance to which the front line moved over those 10 months. And 1 million people were killed there in the process. But unfortunately, Syria is not a field. It's a country rich of tradition. There are people living there and suffering through the conflict, rich in religion. So we cannot allow that to happen. We cannot allow an endless conflict to happen because of varying degrees of interpretations of languages in a communique. So we need to go down to the business of negotiations. And as to the role of the international community, this is going to be the role of the international community. First, now, as spearheaded by Russia and the United States, we are trying to bring them together. And as they come together, it will be the role of the international community, Lakhdar Brahim, and all of us who have an influence on all the parties, to make sure that they agree, that they stop this nonsense of endless bloodshed.
I just have a follow-up. I have a follow-up question on that because
please, I'm sorry.
I think you
I'm sorry.
You mentioned preconditions, sir. Can you give us a couple that you think they have? And secondly, are you continuing to ship weapons to the Syrian government?
I'm sorry?
I said you mentioned preconditions.
Yeah.
And can you give us a couple that you think?
No,
that
there is.
Are you continuing to ship weapons?
I don't have immediate information on the second question. On the first one, yes, I believe that this kind of interpretation of one of the clauses is a precondition, that they want a certain interpretation to be established even before going to the talks. And to me, there is a communique. If you want to implement it, you just go to the table. It's a long communique. There are many important clauses, including, of course, this one in that communique. But they themselves, it should be. I mean, one thing we agreed from the outset of the crisis in the Security Council. You will recall presidential statement August 3, 2011, that there should be Syrian-led, all-inclusive political process. Unfortunately, we see that some countries are trying to lead the Syrian-led political process, and sometimes in the wrong direction. But fortunately, we have this joint Russian-American initiative to convene a Geneva II conference.
Now, she asked about what you sensed as were the preconditions, but were they also convincing? What questions do you still have that they didn't answer, or that they didn't have?
It's an endless conversation. I think it was encouraging that the question I was asking, they were trying to answer. Some answers were not entirely satisfactory, as I'm sure some of the things I was saying was not entirely satisfactory to them. But this is the nature of dialogue. I think it's a good dialogue. As you know, Russia has been maintaining active dialogue with various opposition groups throughout the crisis, and I like to think that this has been an important element of that continued dialogue.
Was ceasefire discussed?
No, I don't think. No, I don't think it was mentioned.
Can I ask one follow-up, going back to something you said earlier, which was, unless I misunderstood it, that the subject of arms request by the opposition, was that mentioned at this meeting, or were you alluding to earlier?
It was mentioned. It was mentioned. But within, so many aspects of the situation were mentioned. It was mentioned. I did not specifically address that. I addressed the broader concern which we have, that things may be heading in the direction of a prolonged conflict without end. And that is a concern which I think they understood,
because Ambassador Grant had said that it did not come up in this meeting. Can you give us a little more of the context?
You should ask Ambassador Grant.
Ambassador Rose said that the vast majority of states in the General Assembly have recognized this grouping as a legitimate representative.
He is such a great mathematician, but our approach is political. We know that there is a government in Damascus, and we know that we need to deal with that government in order to, this is what we're trying to do, to arrange Geneva II, where the government and the opposition can meet and discuss the future of Syria.
And the 107 that voted for that resolution, was that to recognize this grouping? That's how he seemed to present it. 107 votes in the GA meant
I have no idea.
I mean,
I think that entire discussion was completely out of place, because this meeting is not about that. This meeting, and we had an understanding about it in the Security Council. This meeting is about trying to move ahead the political process and discuss other concerns, but certainly not about recognition of anybody.
These conditions torpedo any chance of a conference.
I don't want to use such strong terms, torpedo, but obviously this, at least this is my understanding. At this point, this is a sort of a condition which they see as something which has not been satisfied. So
it's cannot accept this in your view.
Well, I think this is a precondition which creates problems for the convening of the Geneva II conference, and they should discuss those things as they get together in Geneva. The last question, please.
What are the chances for Geneva now? After this meeting, what are the chances?
Well, I wouldn't. I think we're still working very actively. I think that still there are sort of good chances for the Geneva II to be convened, because the alternative would be so horrifying. So it's definitely better to keep trying. Thank you.